I'll get started while people are still filtering in. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Stout. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Prison Policy Initiative. For those of you who don't know us well, Prison Policy Initiative is a nonprofit organization that works nationally to expose the harms of mass incarceration and then work on advocacy campaigns to help fix them. I've been the director of advocacy here for about 2 years. Prior to that, I worked a lot on the end of money bail in Illinois. So I have spent a lot of time in and around jails and then have had the opportunity to work with our wonderful panelists and my colleague Emmett on a number of jail expansion projects, resisting jail expansion projects around the country. So what we're going to do today is have a brief presentation from me and Emmett about some of the things that Prison Policy Initiative has learned over our years working on campaigns across the country involving jail expansion. And then we'll spend the majority of our time with our amazing panelists who are from really about as all over the country as you can get, East Coast, West Coast, and Hawaii. Talking about their individual jail fights and some of the issues that have come up in those fights. So just to start us off, we're at a moment where billions of dollars are being diverted from strategies and programs that we know work to fix community safety, crime prevention, and to reduce disparities in our criminal legal system. We're seeing money diverted at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And while that's happening, we're also seeing massive amounts of money poured into jail construction projects. And I mean truly massive. Cost projections for jail construction projects routinely run into the hundreds of millions, sometimes even billions of dollars. And what that means is that we're investing in punishment. It's a divestment in community-based responses, and it's an investment in cages. We want to find ways in our communities to redistribute those resources, to stop investing in things that don't work, including jails, and start investing in things that they do. So I will turn it over to Emmett.
Hi, everyone. I think I need to spotlight myself here.
Gotcha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Emmett Sanders. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Associate here at Prison Policy Initiative. I've been with PPI for about 2 years myself. And prior to that, I did a lot of organizing and research advocacy around carceral surveillance. And I'm coming to this work as someone who's also directly impacted. And so, I've experienced a lot of the systems that we're talking about changing. Um, I'm grateful to you all for being here today to share with us and to learn from our panelists. And I'm particularly grateful to them for being a part of this today. So, Carrie Ann Schroeder of ACLU Hawaii, Liz Bloom Gutierrez of Decarcerate Sacramento, and Michael Collins of Color of Change. So they'll be talking with us today about pushes for new jail construction in their jurisdictions and how they've been working with the community members to sort of challenge these narratives and push back. Sarah?
Great. Screen shared here. All right. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to do a couple things. First, we're going to identify some common narratives that we've seen repeated across the country that have been used to drive jail expansion. We'll discuss how those jail expansion projects generally progress, what the steps of them are, and identify the key players and points of intervention. I'll talk a little bit about something that Prison Policy Initiative has focused on specifically, which is needs assessments and the weaknesses of some of those needs assessments that are created, usually by architecture firms, in order to push jail construction forward. And then we'll go into a panelist discussion. We have a number of questions we're going to ask our panelists, and then there will also be time for Q&A. Pass it back to Emmett.
Thanks, Sarah. So First, maybe we could just talk about some common narratives that drive jail expansion, right? So we've identified really three. So jail expansion doesn't just usually happen, right? Usually the push for new jail expansion is preceded by a number of narratives with depicting real problems with the jail. So you'll often see articles, you'll hear talk about things like overcrowding or understaffing, other issues, and that'll happen well before a new jail is actually proposed as the solution. But just as often, most of the problems don't actually lie with the physical condition of the jail itself, but rather with the policies, the practices, and frankly, the people who run these things. So here are just three common narratives that are used to justify spending millions, or as we'll see later, sometimes billions of dollars on new jail construction. The first is the contemporary argument. Essentially, our jail is outdated and it's unsafe. We need to modernize for safety and security. Uh, Interestingly enough, the contemporary argument often includes talk of things like staffing shortages or an inability to recruit, right? Um, Basically, sheriffs are arguing that they can't get people to work in old jails because no one wants to be in the jail. One of the main problems with this argument is that new jails don't mean new policies, right? Then they certainly don't fix things like staffing issues. In fact, creating a bigger jail when you can't staff the one that you actually have now has created massive problems for a number of jurisdictions. I think one good example of that is Thurston County, Washington. So taxpayers spend around $430,000 per year on taxes for a new $45 million jail that sat empty for about 6 years just because they couldn't staff it, right? The second argument is the capacity argument. Very simply, we just don't have enough space to hold everyone we want to incarcerate. Um, Now, things like out-of-county housing costs, overcrowding, increasing crime rates, those are associated with that argument right there. And the big problem with this argument is that it misdirects focus from what the actual problem is, which is why are there so many people in our jail? Um,
Hey,
so
Emmett, I just want to pause you really quick. I'm hearing from people that we're not seeing our ASL interpreters, and I want to make sure we do, obviously.
okay.
Um, I'm gonna troubleshoot a little bit here. I apologize to everyone. Um, Ebony, I'm just gonna remove the spotlight and put it back and see if that helps fix the problem. Um, we should be able to see our interpreters now. Let me just see whether we can. Sorry. Um, just seeing me in the PowerPoint. Okay. I think, sorry. I think what we'll need to do is spotlight only our ASL interpreters, just so that we make sure that we can see them while the PowerPoint's up. So I will do that right now. Um, okay. Sounds like we can see them now. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And apologies, folks. Um, so yeah, the problem with the capacity argument is that it misdirects focus from the actual problem, which is again, why do we have so many people in our jail? Why are we incarcerating so many people? So very often capacity concerns are driven by unsustainable policies that are centering punishment over those people, right? I think a great example of that is Greene County, Missouri. They built a brand new jail, was supposed to resolve their capacity issues for at least a decade. And 2 years later, they were right back over capacity again. But if you look, you'll also see them doing things like, rounding up and arresting unhoused folks, so, criminalizing poverty, this kind of thing. And so their own needs assessment actually noted that the jail's growth was unsustainable and that the increase in the jail population was driven in part, at least, by there being just more space in the jail to incarcerate people with. Finally, the compassionate argument, which is honestly the most insidious because it not only co-opts our empathy, but it also co-opts the suffering of people who are in these cages and in order to actually build more, sometimes shinier cages, right? So common narratives you'll hear here include the jail as a service provider for folks with mental health support needs or substance use issues, or you'll see very publicized stories of in custody deaths to try to use that, turn those to build a bigger jail. Um, the problem here is that incarceration in general undermines well-being in every single possible way. It's associated with higher suicide rates, higher overdose rates, both in jail and after release. It negatively impacts stabilizing forces such as housing, employment, family support, community engagement. Not to mention that often jail deaths aren't the result of a deteriorating building, the result of medical negligence or even an abusive staff culture, right? Um, I think a good example of this is Broome County, New York. They spent around $7 million to expand their jail after numerous jail deaths. But they kept the same medical service provider, the same one that had been sued multiple times and had even been condemned by the state's medical review board for medical negligence in the past. So what happened is that people not only continued to die in custody, but you saw actually slight increase in the number of deaths after the expansion. So I'll just turn it back over to Sarah now to walk us through some progression, jail progression, and points of intervention.
You'd think that after all these years, I would learn to unmute. Sure. So let's talk about some key players in jail construction. Now, every county, every state that is dealing with jail construction will have a slightly different set of players. But there are some key players who tend to reappear and reappear. The first is obviously sheriffs. In most places, sheriffs are going to be the people operating your county jails. And generally, their budgets and the jail budgets are closely intertwined. So increasing the size of the jail generally also means increasing the sheriff's budget because it involves staffing and paying attention to who's actually going to work in that jail. Generally, that means that I wouldn't say it's been 100% universal, but in general, sheriffs tend to be some of the biggest pushers of building new jails. It benefits their bottom line, and they are often the people making the case the loudest that a new jail is necessary. The second kind of entity we see that is sort of an interesting one because they don't show up in other kinds of fights is jail construction and needs assessment companies and firms. Often these are architecture firms. They're private organizations or consultants whose main job, outside of the jail context is to build buildings. Very often we will see that counties will contract the same company to make the assessment of how many beds are needed in a jail as it's the same company that they eventually want to hire to build those beds. So the conflict of interest is pretty obvious and yet often isn't talked about in these meetings where people are bringing up needs assessments. There are some slightly more independent groups that are not architecture firms that do needs assessments, but for the most part, we see private architecture firms in that role. Then there's county officials. There's a huge number of them in any given setting. You've got boards of supervisors or county board members. Obviously, sometimes jails are city jails, in which case you're dealing with city councils. And sometimes you're dealing with state level jails in systems where the state actually controls local jails. In general, these officials are the folks who put out the request for proposals for needs assessments. They're the people who start asking the questions, how many beds do we think we need? Do we need to build new construction? And they're the people who ultimately decide if that new construction is warranted and figure out what funding is necessary to do it. And then we also see that there are outside officials that get involved. Pushes for new jail construction can come from outside the county. They can be supported by state legislators. And there's also the element of litigation and consent decrees and other kinds of judicial involvement in jails in situations where someone has sued because of the conditions in the jails. Sometimes those kinds of lawsuits come with other officials who may be advocating either explicitly or implicitly for the building of a new jail. So let's talk about how we've seen some of these projects go forward and what some of the points of intervention are. For those of you who are not familiar with that lingo, points of intervention are the questions is basically asking, when can you do something? A lot of times it feels as an activist like things are moving so quickly and sometimes so non-transparently that we can't actually find where the points are that we can jump in and do something. And we're going to talk through a little bit where some of those points of intervention have been successful. So generally, one of the first official steps for county officials to start the process of building a new jail is a needs assessment request for proposal. So what that means is that they put out a request for companies to say, we want to be the people who do the needs assessment, who make the decision and do the analysis about how many beds are necessary and what a new facility should look like. Generally, that should be an open bid process, but it isn't always. Um, but there will often be some kind of public notice that this is happening, and it can be your first sign that something is moving forward that you want to pay attention to. You can consider whether that and pay attention to whether that request for proposal is adhered to the required procedures and make sure that in those public conversations about that request for proposal, people are talking about the things that we want them to be focusing on in the long term. And that means big picture questions. Why are there so many people in your local jail? How is it being used? What are the local bail practices like? What could we be doing to decrease the number of beds that we need instead of increasing them? Another important point of intervention is various, and there can be a lot of these, county board meetings and votes. There's usually one around the time of the request for proposal, but there will be more as time goes on, as various people present various information to different decision-making bodies. At most of these meetings, as a general rule, there will be some ability for public comment, and that can be a really great opportunity for you to bring in your folks to actually talk about why you don't want a new jail, why you want money spent somewhere else. It also lets you ask critical questions. Particularly once the needs assessment exists, and I'll talk about this in a second, there are a lot of questions that you're going to want to make sure that you're posing publicly so that county board members are held to account for having answers to them. Questions not just about conditions and how much things are going to cost, but also questions about the systemic reasons there are so many people in the jail to begin with. And then a last point of intervention, which is somewhere that we have seen a lot of activists have success, is in various kinds of bond initiatives, tax votes, and other referendums and measures on the ballot that are necessary to fund jails. Jails are really expensive. Building new jails is really expensive. In many, many cases, some kind of tax increase, some kind of bond, some kind of new source of revenue is needed in order to make the project go forward. Often, the local laws require that kind of revenue generation be voted on by the public. And that, of course, means that with sufficient organizing, you can make very clear to people that what they are voting on is whether or not they want money spent on a new jail. There are lots of places where bond measures and property tax raising measures or sales tax raising measures have been the way to defeat new jail construction. And so one of the first questions you should always be asking is how, meaning literally how, with what money does the county intend to pay for this? Because as soon as it involves something that the public has to vote on, you've got a point of intervention. So let's talk about jail needs assessments. Um, First of all, I'll give a plug for Prison Policy Initiative. We have been working specifically looking at jail needs assessments for a couple years now, analyzing those jail needs assessments and basically poking holes in them. As I brought up earlier, jail needs assessments generally are completed by architecture firms that have a conflict of interest inherently. They're usually the same companies that eventually want to build the jail. Um, and they're also contracted by county officials who usually also have an interest in building the jail. I will say, looking across the country, it's not like it's never happened. I've seen one needs assessment that said, actually, we assessed the needs of the county and we don't think you should build a new jail. It was a very, very interesting needs assessment. But I've only seen one. For the most part, these things tend to conclude that new jail beds are necessary. Now, those conclusions can be more nuanced. Sometimes they'll talk about needing lots and lots of new beds, like doubling the capacity of a jail. Sometimes they'll suggest a modest increase. But almost always we see that these needs assessments suggest more beds. So what is usually involved in these needs assessments? The first thing is usually, and this is sort of where the meat of the analysis usually comes up, is in population projection, trying to predict how many people will be in the jail. And usually this is done on like a 10, 20, 30-year timeline, right? To try and cover the whole life cycle of the building. There are a lot of different measures that go into the population projection. Usually these are done in a way that I would describe as a black box. The needs assessment usually will list out all the things they considered in terms of setting that number of beds that they'll ultimately need, but often are not super clear on how exactly they did the math to get from point A to point B. Some of the things that are often included, though, are the current average daily jail population, the average length of stay, admissions and bookings, larger crime trends in the community, and then also county population trends. Is the county itself getting bigger or smaller? Those are usually those are moments where you want to look at each of those numbers and ask questions about whether they could change. For example, we've seen situations where most of these measures point downward, right? The daily jail population is actually decreasing. The average length of stay is decreasing, but the county is getting bigger. And it turns out that they've weighted the one factor that's getting bigger much more strongly than the factors that are getting smaller. So you really want to look at those very carefully. And if you want help, we're happy to help you do that. You want to ask questions about staffing levels. So usually there will be some discussion of staffing levels, almost always. Sheriffs will come forward and say that their jail is understaffed. And there are questions that you should ask about those staffing levels. How difficult is it to staff the current facility? But then how difficult will it be to staff a new facility? A lot of times, if a facility is getting bigger, it means that there will be more need for staff. And in most places, we've found that hiring corrections staff right now is very, very difficult. So there's an honest question that needs to be asked in these conversations of whether it's even possible to staff a jail that's going to be substantially bigger than the one that you currently have. And then you also want to ask questions about how well the staff is working. There are places where, I mean, I think almost every jail that we've worked with has serious staff conduct problems and complaints, but some are more severe than others. And if there are specific complaints about staff in your area, you want to make sure that county board members are aware of that before they start throwing lots more money at that same group of staffing. There will almost always be a facility conditions assessment. I wish that I could say that Prison Policy Initiative was more of an expert on this. This is somewhere where it can sometimes be quite hard to figure out the best way to fight back against conditions uh, complaints, but usually you'll see in a needs assessment, excuse me, things like pictures of locks that are broken and pictures of water damage and other things that are being used as the reasons why a new facility is necessary. One of the questions that's always worth asking, though, is that these needs assessments often don't include an alternate proposal for fixing these conditions other than building a new facility. So all they're doing is saying the only way to fix this is to build a new facility. They're not asking, well, how much would it actually cost to renovate the one we have? Sometimes we'll see evaluations of pretrial diversion programs, bail practices, and other systemic factors that lead to jail population. We're seeing that more and more. It used to be that this kind of analysis was almost never included in a needs assessment. Like it was sort of like these firms either weren't aware or didn't care about these factors. Increasingly, we are seeing needs assessments take these factors into account. So you really want to read those sections carefully and see whether you agree with the analysis. Similarly, demographic data. Who is in the jail? Racial demographics, gender demographics, mental health demographics. We've seen needs assessments that simply don't include this information, which is obviously a red flag and something that you would want to bring to your board's attention. And then we've seen others that have very sophisticated analysis of this demographic data. But often, if you look carefully at that data, it can be really helpful fodder for your arguments about racial disparities and other inequalities happening in your jail. And then last, there is generally a cost analysis. Not always. Sometimes the needs assessment is done sort of separately from a conversation about money, but usually there's some sort of cost analysis in there. And it's worth asking, what are the construction costs for the new jail? That will almost always be there, but make sure that it's also asking the question, what are the ongoing operating costs? If your new jail is going to require a 30% increase in staffing, then not only is it more expensive right now, it's going to be more expensive for a long time. And making sure that people understand those factors and what that money really means can be really helpful. And with that, I will turn it back to Emmett to talk about our discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing our screen, hopefully to allow the spotlights to work better. Emmett?
Thanks, Sarah. So now we'll turn to a conversation with our panelists. Really excited about this. And we're going to learn more about their efforts to oppose jail construction in Oahu, Hawaii, Sacramento, California, and Atlanta, Georgia. Um, we're going to hear about their work and learn some of the strategies that they've used to build community response and to sort of push back against jail construction in their areas. So just by way of quick introduction, let's begin. Carrie Ann Schroeder, maybe we can start spotlighting folks. Carrie Ann Schroeder was born and raised on the island of Maui. She's an attorney and the current policy director of the ACLU Hawaii. In that role, she oversees state policy legislation, safeguarding and advancing civil rights and liberties. Most of her policy work is centered around integrated and intersectional campaigns to decriminalize poverty, reimagine policing, and decarceration. Prior to her time at the ACLU Hawaii, Carrie Ann served as enforcement attorney for Hawaii's Civil Rights Commission, reintegration program director, deputy public defender, and counselor for a Native Hawaiian service program at the University of Hawaii Maui College. Carrie Ann is also a mother and a community advocate, inspired by her family's resilience and experience in the criminal legal system. She's been advocating for transformative justice and investments in what really makes us safe, community-based and cultural systems of care. Liz Bloom Gutierrez has been organizing for criminal legal reform in California for over a decade. Liz co-founded Decarcerate Sacramento in 2019, which has since defeated multiple jail expansion projects in Sacramento County, and has led the county to create its first ever jail population reduction plan. Liz has written numerous works on her organizing in Sacramento, including Decarcerating Sacramento, Confronting Jail Expansion in California's Capital, a chapter of the book, The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration, which published in 2024. And Liz currently works as an independent consultant and lobbyist supporting abolitionist reform in the California state capitol, in addition to continuing local decarceration organizing work. And finally, Michael Collins is the Senior Director for State and Local Government Affairs at Color of Change. In this role, he oversees state and local policy work, including prosecutor accountability, criminal justice reform, and economic justice. Previously, he was a strategic policy and planning director for Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. And in this role, he drafted and implemented policies to stop prosecuting low-level offenses like drug possession and sex work, and opened a sentencing review unit to release people serving lengthy sentences. And before that, he was director at the Drug Policy Alliance's Office of National Affairs in Washington, D.C., where he worked with Congress on a wide variety of drug policy issues, including marijuana reform, criminal justice reform, overdose issues, and more. So thank you all for being here with us today. I'm really excited to get to talk with you. And yeah, maybe we could just open up by just asking folks to just tell us a little bit about the jail fight in your jurisdiction, give us a bit of background about that. Maybe we can start with Michael.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Michael Collins here. I'm going to try and speak slowly and clearly with my Scottish accent. I came to Atlanta about 3 years ago, and there was already a very robust coalition working to reduce jail deaths. The jail in Fulton County, which is part of Atlanta, had seen a number of horrific jail deaths, really undergoing a crisis where 15 people had died in 2022, 10 people died in 2023. And there were a lot of groups at the table working to reduce jail deaths. And, some of the groups were, Women on the Rise, Southern Centre for Human Rights, our local ACLU, really great coalition partners. And part of our belief was that the solution to jail deaths was reducing the jail population safely. But we had the opposition of certain politicians, law enforcement, prosecutors who wanted a $2 billion jail. And they were already quite far down the road to having a $2 billion jail. They had initially approved the plan, they were at the feasibility study stage. And so, you know, my organization, because I had a background in prosecutor work, I played the role of targeting the DA, who is Fannie Willis, who's sort of famous or infamous, whatever way you want to put it, but she's in the news a lot because she handled the Trump prosecution here. And that was kind of like part of our challenge, this like person who was like beloved nationally, but was really like squarely focused on the YSL case, a case against these rappers, and also the Trump case, to the detriment of clearing the case backlog and moving forward with reducing the jail population. And also, she was holding people on astronomical amounts of cash bail. And so, along with our coalition partners, we started to do, op-eds, media interviews, letters, really sort of targeting and highlighting her role in the jail crisis. And she eventually took action to reduce the jail population. That enabled us to pivot to focusing on stopping the $2 billion jail. We were able to sort of essentially make the argument that we don't need a bigger, fancier jail We just need to focus on reducing the jail population, and reducing the jail population is happening. We actually worked with our friends at PPI. We reached out to talk to them about the feasibility study, because the feasibility study was something that the politicians were really hanging their hat on. They were really saying, well, it says we need a new jail, and it was a consulting firm that had done the feasibility study. It cost like $1 million. And so we talked to PPI about, essentially doing something where they would review the study. And we ended up doing a press conference where we released this report on behalf of PPI that essentially debunked the case for the $2 billion jail. It talked about how they were making certain assumptions around staffing. They were making certain assumptions around population growth. I mean, the fact that it was a $2 billion jail, it's such a huge amount of money, was already something that was working in our favor. And we knew that as soon as we started to educate members of the public about it, that they would be skeptical, because in order to pay for the $2 billion jail, their taxes would have to go up, and they would actually have to vote in a referendum to increase their own taxes to pay for this jail. So it was already, a really difficult prospect for people who were pro building the new jail. And I think with a combination of reducing the jail population, the PPI report, we did a lot of advocacy through our coalition. And then, this is going back to, I guess, sort of August 2023, or was it 2024? Sorry, I'm losing my dates here. But essentially, like, the commission ended up voting to sideline the idea of a $2 billion jail. And, we had our victory where they stopped, we stopped this jail in its tracks. We're now, as a coalition, focusing much more on how can we get the population down as much as possible. It's gone down substantially. It's creeping up a bit. The jail population somewhere in the sort of mid 2000 range just now. We believe it should be as low as 1,000 people. But we have all these other challenges coming in just now: the World Cup in Atlanta, a failure by law enforcement to use diversion, a sheriff who is incredibly corrupt and who is dead set on getting a new facility. We have Department of Justice here doing a consent decree. So there's a lot of variables that our coalition is dealing with, but we certainly feel good about having had that initial victory in opposition to the $2 billion jail.
Thank you so much, Michael. I definitely want to get into the consent decree and those conditions of the jail and the sheriff's response to that in a moment. But for right now, maybe we could turn to Carrie Ann to tell us a bit about the situation in Oahu and what they've actually experienced. Carrie Ann? Yeah, can you tell us a bit about your fight?
Sure. Well, we are still in the middle of this battle. Hawaii is at a crossroads, and our governor is on the cusp of making a decision whether to spend under this new proposal another $30 million on top of $20 million that has already been spent for planning for a new expanded jail on the island of Oahu. And the estimated price tag for this jail would be $1 billion. And so I just want to share some context. I think our state is unique in that we have a unified correctional system. So our State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which has recently been renamed and branded as such, they are in charge of our jails and prisons. So we have a jail on the 4 islands: Oahu, Maui, Hawaii, and Kauai. And in addition, we have a number of prisons. We also have contracts, tragically, where we send our people and traffic them to private prisons out of state. And that has been going on for the last 30 years. More on that later. But in terms of this particular fight, there's actually been a push for the last 15, 20 years to build new jails on every single island for all of the reasons you mentioned, that the jails are falling apart. It's old, there's overcapacity at some of them, the compassion argument. And I'll also add another C. In Hawaii, they're perversely using cultural, that this place, jails can be a place of healing. Let's incorporate Native Hawaiian cultural concepts within architectural design and open spaces to lock up, which is primarily Kanaka Maoli, the Native people, of Hawaii. And so it's distinctly perverse. I would add that C under compassion and cultural arguments that's being used. So there have been a number of studies, environmental assessments that have been done. There have been all of these so-called population forecast reports. And they typically say we need to build a new jail for all of these reasons, but they also know that if the legislature, if other stakeholders take other decarceration strategies and steps, particularly bail reform, then there might not be a need for a new jail, or it does not need to be built at a mega jail, larger capacity. And so I want to point out and thank Prison Policy Initiative because they have helped us in this fight. It is still going on. I mentioned this $30 million that's on the table right now. So Governor Josh Green is a medical doctor, and he passed an executive order a year ago listing Hawaii as a trauma-informed care state. And so we're trying to encourage him to recognize that building a jail is trauma-inducing, not trauma-informed care, and that we need to live to those principles. We're also seeing in our fight conflict of interests. The head Department of Budget and Finance, our director, is a former lobbyist for Core Civic. And I raise this because not only is this push to build new jails, but the push is also for a public-private partnership. And so we're looking for the first time ever, potentially, to have a private public corporation to potentially finance, design, construct, and maintain. So when this sort of proposal first came out, we had a number of unions who said, even though some of the correctional officers wanted maybe a new jail, they were pushing back because they saw it as a threat to their employment. But since then, the government has been savvy enough to say, no, we guarantee that they will design, construct, finance, and maintain, but we will continue to operate it. So now the unions have sort of stepped out in general from opposition. What it kind of looks like for us in terms of what we've done and some just kind of highlight level strategies is ACL Hawaii is a part of a reimagining public safety coalition. And we are a really diverse group of people. A number of people have been working on pretrial fairness, bail reform, reentry, housing, street medicine, homelessness, mental health. And so we're housed under this large umbrella. And it's been, I think we're gaining more traction. We've been focusing on shifting narratives and having our own storytelling. So we're using a lot of social media, literally like skits, having other people that typically haven't spoken out on this issue, a number of Native Hawaiian community leaders, with their images, with their quotes, talking about how this is a system that is designed to continue to incarcerate Native Hawaiian people. So we're looking at expanding our messaging. We also put out a budget, first time ever, a budget report recommendations for 2025, looking at all the ways that we could invest in our under-resourced communities. So rather than sort of leaving it up to lawmakers, we're saying if you invest in affordable housing, healthcare, treatment, jobs, youth programs, restorative justice, that's what makes our communities safe. We're also working on legislation. We introduced a measure for a moratorium. Unfortunately, it did not pass. But we've been at it for the last 15, 20 years to try to slow down this, this train wreck, really. So we're using fiscal arguments. We're going to the Capitol. We're having meetings with the governor's policy advisors. We've been partnering with other unlikely allies in some instances. And we are also taking it to the Oversight Correctional Commission, which is a new body formed in the last few years. We were trying to convince the commission to take a position that building a new expanded jail is not only unnecessary, but harmful if we invest in decarceration strategies. And the commission put out a letter last year. They're not at the point of our coalition, but they are suggesting to the governor that they pause this planning until they invest in what can be done to reduce the number of people in this particular jail on Oahu. And I want to note that of our demographics at OCCC, the Oahu jail, we're looking at 30 to 40% of people who are houseless, over 60% of the people who are there on pre-trial status. And when you exclude work furlough, At one point in time, it was 78% of the people who are there are pretrial, which just is such a high rate. And for some people who are locked up for as little as $50 bail, it's just egregious. And so we're also going, the coalition, we've been going to some of the neighborhood boards, and rather just focusing on the jail itself, we're talking about how do we reimagine public safety, how to invest in what works, because we find that sometimes if we're just saying no to the jail, people will say, well, what else? What are you at? What else? What are the solutions? And we are showing them that there are solutions. And one final point, a number of years ago, we were on the cusp of building a new jail for our youth. And they were starting to send some of our girls to an out-of-state prison. And the community came out in horror and said, we need to stop this. We need to look at what works. And within a lawsuit that the ACLU filed, as well as Department of Justice intervention, the community came together. And since then, for the last 15 years, we have decarcerated the youth to the point that a point in time, there were 0 girls in our youth facilities. And we know that that model of community care, diversion, providing for services, comprehensive for not only for the individuals inside, but their families can work and has worked. And we want that to be applied to the adult system. So that just kind of gives you a snapshot of what we've been doing, where we're at. And I want to note that Prison Policy Initiative will be presenting to the Oversight Commission on this analysis in 2 months. And we believe that will gain further traction in this movement and this fight. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate the fourth C that you mentioned there, the cultural, the way that they're using the culture to sort of incarcerate, turn it carceral. And I love the way that y'all are leaning into community there as a response, right, to this carceral humanism. And I definitely want to get back to that as well. Um, but maybe right now we can just turn to Liz to get some background about what's been happening in Sacramento because it has been a lot. Liz?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emmett. Um, I guess I want to start by giving some background on California's landscape before Decarcerate Sacramento even formed, which will help, I think, provide context to the multiple jail expansions that we've prevented in the last 6 years. Conditions, litigation, and class action lawsuits focused on jail and prison conditions have been the primary driver of jail expansions across the state of California, and I also think across the country. But really, when we started organizing against jail expansion in 2019, our local class action lawsuit had not been finalized yet. We were actually fighting against funding that came from public safety realignment, which, if you haven't heard of, was a state bill that passed in 2011 that shifted non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual crimes to be sentences to be served at the county level. There's 58 counties in California, and there were multiple bills that followed that that came with hundreds of millions of dollars, like flooding into counties, offering them support to expand their jail systems. So that public safety realignment in California really changed the landscape, and I think was maybe unexpected for a lot of organizers who, of course, this stemmed from conditions litigation on the state level with 35 state prisons across the state. But the solution that the governor and the state chose was to shift the population instead of release people. And so that I think is just important context for California. And I think there's been a lot of lessons learned there. So when we started organizing locally in Sacramento County against the expansion of one of our 2 county jails, the Rio Cosumnes Correctional Center, in a more rural area of Elk Grove, the county was considering what they called a grant from SB 1022, one of the many bills that, again, kind of provided a lot of funding for a county jail expansion in response to realignment. And, we were fighting against what, what the county was framing as a gift from the state, whereas it was actually a lease revenue bond, which would have cost taxpayers double the amount to pay off in the end. So that fiscal argument was really strong for our first jail fight. We also, of course, brought in voices from, our loved ones who were currently or previously incarcerated in Sacramento County jails, and really, centered our advocacy around the fact that building a larger jail was not going to was not worth the money. So at that point, we hadn't had a finalized consent decree of our own. It was mainly like the county advocating for accepting this quote unquote gift or this grant, which is not what it was. So with that context, so we started in June of 2019. 5 months later, we got the board to officially vote to stop that jail expansion plan and reject $80 million from the state that they had already spent over $8 million on architectural plans, and everyone kind of thought that what we were trying to do was impossible when we started because they had put so much money into it already. But that was a huge win, and I will say the landscape has changed a lot since 2019. I know we'll talk about that later. But that was we also unfortunately nothing was done there, because as soon as we stopped that first jail expansion, our local class action lawsuit was finalized in 2020, and that we had already been hearing that was starting the idea for a second jail expansion or a brand new jail building next to our downtown jail, which I'll talk about more later. But yeah, I think we had a lot of success. The fiscal argument, the debunking the carceral humanism arguments, and I will dive more into that as we go. I'm excited to get into it.
Great. Thanks so much. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, so people who are proposing the jail in Sacramento have been using ADA requirements, right? They've been using the American Disability Act requirements to try to push through billions of dollars on a new jail, is to ensure that that the jail can fairly incarcerate people with ability needs. Maybe you can just talk a bit about how this compassion argument is sort of playing out there and how y'all have been able to respond?
Sure, yeah. So this is all stemming from that class action lawsuit that I mentioned, which is called the Mays v. Sacramento. Lorenzo Mays was the lead plaintiff. There was a handful of individuals. This lawsuit just exposed like the horrific human rights and abuses that were happening in the jail and that are still happening in the jail. And so this lawsuit, Mays v. Sacramento, outlined 5 main areas for like the required improvement, including disability rights, so ADA, the use of solitary confinement, suicide prevention, mental health care, and medical care. And a lot of that has to do with patient privacy or HIPAA as well. So there's over 400 requirements in this Mays consent decree. And our team has read it many times, and only about 4 have to do with the physical building itself, mostly around ADA and patient privacy issues, and mainly the downtown jail. So again, this was finalized in 2020, and in the discussions of finalizing it, they were already talking about building this new jail annex. But ADA has become like one of the core talking points for the county for why they need a new building. I think partially because we've debunked a lot of their reasonings from, in the last 5 years, where they say that they need a new jail to provide better mental health care or to provide better medical care. But, we provide very real examples, sometimes, I mean, often from recordings from people inside, or all of our membership are directly impacted, or our founding members, and um, just really centering the stories and the real life examples of why a new building doesn't change the behavior of jail staff, right? Um, so for ADA, I think most recently we are our sheriff is going on a lot of radio shows and um, a lot of media talking about how there's no way we're going to meet the May's consent decree without building a new jail. Where meanwhile, if the sheriff really cared about people with disabilities, he could make changes today or tomorrow, operational policy changes, that would give people with disabilities slightly more dignity, while inside. So for example, right now, um, people, so right now he chooses to house people with disabilities and mobility issues in the downtown jail, which is not ADA accessible. The showers, and since 2020, by the way, our county has already allocated over $13 million for um, the ADA renovations that can happen. So, for example, grab bars in the showers, making showers, just installing different equipment in the showers to make it ADA accessible. Right now, um, we're hearing from folks who uh, who monitor the jails, that people are having to drag themselves across shower floors on a regular basis. It's just like horrific what's happening on a daily basis right now. But our second county jail is already much more accessible. It's dorm style, so um, they're able to maneuver in different ways. And so the sheriff could decide to house people in the jail that is more accessible and that would allow people to have slightly more dignity while incarcerated, which, you know, we often feel like these people shouldn't be incarcerated in the first place. Um, but that's not happening, right? And so I think a huge challenge that we're facing, and this is an example of, is, the county and the sheriff, the county can't necessarily tell the sheriff how to operate his jails, right? He manages those buildings. He manages the operations of those buildings. He's often the gatekeeper of medical care, and he decides where people are housed. And so if he refuses and says it's too inconvenient to house people with disabilities at the jail that's a little farther away, um, it's really hard to, um, it's just really hard for the county to make him do things that would prevent a new jail from being needed. Part of it is like there's courtrooms attached to the downtown jail, and it's closer to courthouses, and so um, and the convenience argument of the sheriff, unfortunately, is like respected at such a great level, unfortunately, in county decision making, way more than we think it should be. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, I definitely appreciate that. Yeah, it's so interesting to me, like how do we respond to carceral humanism when it's used to, do what it does. And I think what y'all have done has been amazing. Actually, in keeping with that, and the need and carceral humanism as an argument, maybe we can ask Michael, um, I'm curious. So the Fulton County Sheriff has actually claimed that the deteriorating conditions of the jail have both made it impossible to adequately staff the jail, but also to take care of people, right? And it's the reason why so many people are dying, have died in Fulton County Jail. Um, can you talk about a bit about why spending $2 billion isn't an actual solution to jail deaths there, and maybe talk a bit about what's actually killing people there? What's the solution that we could look to?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening to Liz's experience because the sheriff does tend to be an individual who's like highly respected in the community and highly respected among legislators, and that certainly was historically the case with Sheriff Labatt in Fulton County. However, he was somebody who I think our coalition was able to highlight was part of the problem of the failed jail system in Fulton County. And so he had actually, he used to come to the Fulton County Commission meetings after every jail death with his hand out and say, like, we can fix this, just give me more money. It actually turned out that in one occasion he had asked for, I think it was a $5 million contract for a company to make heart monitors so that they could monitor people who were in the facility and then be able to know, if they were having medical issues. The money ended up going nowhere. It was a boondoggle. It went to people who were his funders. And that sort of started this kind of whiff of corruption about him. He began to be somebody who wasn't to be trusted, right? And so it then came out that he was using what's called an inmate welfare fund, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's money that's supposed to be used for incarcerated individuals for their betterment, for their health, for supplies, that sort of stuff. He was using that to hire DJs, to throw parties. He spent a lot of money on honey baked ham. On one occasion, he actually showed up to a public meeting with three or four individuals who were in shackles to get them to testify in favor of a new jail. So he just over time became this kind of discredited character. And that meant we were able to say, like, why would you give this guy $2 billion, right? Why would you give a guy who has misappropriated so much funding already a brand new facility for even more corruption? And we were able to point, and I think this was something, Emmett, that your report pointed out with PPI, was that this isn't like a structural issue, it's a culture issue, right? What the sheriff is doing, the way that he runs the facility, the way that staff abuse individuals, a lot of the things that ended up being documented in the Department of Justice report weren't to do with, the physical conditions of the facility, but a culture of impunity. And I think, you can build a new facility, you can spend $2 billion, you can spend $3 billion, but unless you're tackling the culture, I mean, we have staffing shortages because no one wants to work with this guy, and it isn't to do with bonuses and overtime and that sort of stuff. And so we were able to highlight that in our quest to stop the $2 billion jail and sort of make this sheriff what I think he is now, which is a thoroughly discredited figure politically.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's truly remarkable. When you mention the honey baked hams, it's kind of an entire thing there. It's something people should look into. Um, so actually, maybe we could just turn to Carrie Ann right now, because you mentioned earlier people organizing and responding to the idea of shipping uh, girls in Hawaii to be held out of state. And I'm kind of curious about this because Hawaii is pretty far away from other states, right? So the folks who are advancing this new jail construction in Oahu, they're arguing that overcrowding has led not only to these safety issues, but it's also the reason why they have to send people overseas, an ocean away, basically to be held in out of state jails. Um, can you talk a bit about why this capacity argument, which is essentially what it is it really doesn't hold up when we're looking at, at actually what's happening in Hawaii?
Sure, absolutely. So I do want to share a little bit about the context of people being sent out of state. It started in 1995 due to prison overcrowding, our major prison on the island of Oahu. And at that time, Governor Ben Cayetano said that there would be a decision to transfer our people to out-of-state prisons as a, quote, temporary solution. This year marks 30 years of this inhumane practice of banishing our people to literally, a foreign place. And not only are Native Hawaiians disproportionately represented in our jails and prisons, but they're even transferred at a higher rate out of state. So we can just see this multiplier effect of how this impacts Native Hawaiian families. At one point, we had nearly 2,000 people out of state. And right now, they're essentially consolidated in Arizona at Saguaro Prison. But at one point in time, we had people in Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and there's probably Minnesota. I'm probably forgetting even the people were literally being moved around like pawns to these different private prisons, mostly consolidated by what was then Corrections Corporation of America, now CoreCivic. We have since decarcerated. The number right now of people out of state is 800. There was a resolution passed this session for the next 5 years to essentially start the process of trying to bring everyone home. We hope that lawmakers and the community and the department will literally follow through and abide by this. But there's more work to be done. But again, even by building this jail, which we feel like there is this myth and they're perpetuating it, is this idea that, well, if we build a larger expanded mega jail, that we can bring more people home. And these are different populations. This is a jail, not a prison. The people who are out of state are typically have more than a 1 year incarceration. Some of them might be lifers or maybe doing literally years before they are released. But so what's happening though is that some people in the community are saying, well, we don't like the idea of building more jails and prisons, but we want our people to come home. And so our job as the coalition and community is to educate people to say that by building a new jail, it does not bring people home. And the reality is that when you look at our prisons, we have one prison on Hawaii Island. We have 3 on Oahu, 1 for women, 2 for men. All of these prisons, but more so 3 of them, are severely, quote, under capacity, both design and operational. And so it raises this question. If there are empty beds, and I'll say it, it's cages, right? Still, we want more people in the community. Why are we still transferring people literally thousands of miles away to private prisons where there's a whole set of other rules? Solitary confinement has been occurring indefinitely for years. People have died. There's been suicides. That also happens in our jails and prisons as well. I mean, there's still problems with both, but at least if they're home, there's maybe a greater likelihood to see their family visits. There's a greater likelihood that they can start connecting with community service providers and start the process of transition. And so we are trying to make it very clear that by building this new jail, it does not mean that people are going to come home from private prisons, and that what we should invest in instead is diversion infrastructure. When 30 to 40% of the people are houseless, when we're looking at 60 to 70% of people are pretrial status, what we need to invest in diversion, get people into the community, especially into treatment and mental health. We have one Hawaii State Hospital, literally, and there are people there that even the Department of Health has stated in the past, there are people who are there who do not meet the medical acuity level, but because we don't have other step down sort of medical transitional facilities. And so we need to invest into behavioral health care, centers, community hubs, residential treatment. Some of our islands don't even have a residential treatment if they're experiencing drug addiction, if they're lucky enough and have the resources to get to another island. And so instead of investing into that, into our community spaces, they're proposing this jail. And so we need to keep debunking these myths while still working on bringing our people home.
Um, Thank you so much for that. And again, like the idea that we're going to invest in a jail instead of actually investing in what keeps us safe and what makes us healthy is, this is what this is all about. Um, Actually, I do have some more questions, but let's do some audience Q&A right now because we have some pretty good questions here. So maybe I can just turn it over to Sarah for some of that. Thanks.
Hey everybody, yeah. Here, and I will ask these questions and just give me a wave, panelists, if you want to talk, and I will spotlight you and we can move forward because we've got some really great questions from the audience. So the first is one that I feel like is a constant question for me, which is when a jail is dangerously outdated, when there are genuine conditions problems, how should advocates toe the line between calling for necessary updates to those problems so that people have better quality of life while not inadvertently co-signing jail expansion? Anyone want to take that one? Here, Carrie
I'll try and answer
Ann.
that.
Oh, okay. I'll do you and then Carrie Ann.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Carrie Ann.
I was reluctantly taking
Wait, what are we doing?
it anyway. I think this is go. Oh, and go ahead.
I think we have to acknowledge in our community that the conditions at this OCCC are unacceptable. And I think we've made it clear. We held a press conference about a week ago, and that's something that automatically the governor came back and was trying to say, well, conditions are deteriorating. We need to do something. He called these new mega jail to be rehabilitative, restorative. And so we need to acknowledge that. And so we are saying, well, have you explored all of your options? We want a community hub. If you need to build something, build a diversion center, build a one-stop shop where people can get the services they need. But as far as the jail itself, if there are sections that are deteriorating, crumbling, they can do a renovation. A renovation is far less cost than a $1 billion plus jail. And we want to point out that even with the EIS, environmental assessment, and other sort of studies, there's literally study after study after study. And none of the studies have included an assessment of what it would cost to do a renovation. I mean, we have schools that are deteriorating. We don't demolish schools and build typically an entirely new school. But yet we, for some reason, think that we should just bulldoze the jail and build an entirely new, larger cage. And so if we can do renovations for schools, for other places of community care, that can be done. And unless they can prove to us that it costs more money to renovate than it is to build an entirely expanded jail, but that has yet to be produced.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think this is one of like the biggest challenges because it's very easy to get sucked into a discussion about jail design and you don't want to be there. And so I think that you can acknowledge that a current jail, a current facility is a disaster, it's mismanaged, it's a danger, but you must sort of I encourage people to stay away from the kind of jail design aspects of what a facility should look like and repairs look like. Like that's beyond the realm of our expertise. I encourage people, and what we as a coalition have tried to do is focus on like what can be done to improve conditions and improve the population. And so the focus on reducing incarcerations, right? The focus on exhausting other solutions. I think one of the big problems of people who advocate for new jail is that it is the first thing that they think of, right? It's like the expansionary mindset that there has to be a new jail, it has to be bigger. And then after that, they start talking about like mental health and, all this kind of like nice fancy things to make the facility attractive, if you like, to progressives, and that's just a sort of bad path to go down. And so I do think it's really important that folks stick to their principles around, reducing the jail population and don't get drawn into, the us sort of becoming like a jail architect because that's not who we are, that's not where we be.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, I think that's a really important insight. All right, another question that we had here that I think is a really valuable one is about building coalitions, working with other groups to oppose jail construction and how you do that. So the question is, how have you dealt with fractured coalitions or advocates with differing goals? For example, some advocates who want no new jail versus ones who want a smaller new jail versus one who want a totally new jail due to conditions arguments or concerns about family members inside or any other host of issues. How do you deal with reconciling those different issues among a coalition?
Just speak briefly on this. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
we got you.
Before 2019, there wasn't really an organization in Sacramento County that was focused on the jail system and preventing jail expansion. And while we've always done coalition building, when we bring people into our organization, we are very intentional about like being upfront with our values and goals and making sure that people are aligned. I would say the biggest challenge that comes up in regards to this question is, we have a jail hotline. We do mass mailings to the 3,000 plus people incarcerated in our county. We do jail visiting. And, not like I think the toughest conversations are with people who are currently incarcerated and who are like, yeah, new building sounds great, for various reasons, and having those difficult conversations. And kind of being like, well, what's the root cause of like the issues that you're facing? Is it the building or is it the staff? And so a lot of those conversations are happening with like our previously incarcerated organizers and currently incarcerated people. But I would say that that's something that continues to come up and also yeah, I think just like being intentional about who you're organizing with. And in Sacramento County, I think people do look to our our organization as like um, some of the experts on these issues, but we also can't control what people say in public comments. So um, yeah, I don't know. I think that's what I'll say.
Carrie Ann?
Say that human nature coalitions can be messy. uh, but I think also there's such strength and diversity that comes from working in coalition. And what we found, similar to what Liz is sharing, is that when people are coming into this Reimagining Public Safety Coalition, which is relatively new, we have been also very intentional, trying to focus on what we consider our key sort of values, policies, talking points. And within our coalition, we have people who are much more on like one end, like, well, we should renovate because the conditions are so inhumane. And I have family inside, I've been there, I know what it's like. Also, people who have been inside and impacted who are pushing for abolition. So we have the gamut. And I think that naturally these sort of tensions will rise, but we keep trying to bring people back to say, if we're trying to reimagine what community safety looks like, let's get to the root causes of these issues. Let's look at ways that we can divert people. And we sort of start from that principle. And even if we may have some differences around the edges, we try to focus on what is our common ground. But at times it can get difficult. And I think that as your coalition grows and as you're doing more like community engagement, trying to again elevate your own members to what are our clear talking points, because sometimes if people get interviewed sort of like quickly, maybe they might diverge. And so we're just trying to remind people that if you are representing the coalition, really be true and value those principles and what we are pushing for overall, the big picture.
Michael, anything you want to add, or should I go to the next one?
You
Cool.
go to the next one.
Yeah, so the third one, it occurs to me, I think Liz might have something to say about this, maybe some other folks. The question is, how have you responded to stakeholders who sort of shirk responsibility who don't want to own being the people who asked for a new jail, who say, well, it's not me who needs it, it's because of some federal consent decrees, or it's because of this, or it's because of that. How have you successfully pinned stakeholders down to what they can do and what their power is in a given in situation?
Great. I wanted to talk about I wanted to talk about our new sheriff and DA, so this is perfect. Yeah, I think I want to like connect this to how the landscape has changed in the last 5+ years in Sacramento County as well. We have a new sheriff who wasn't, around, wasn't, or he was actually a state assemblyman when, our lawsuit was being finalized, but he and our new DA just took office about a year ago. And so, I think there was a moment in our campaign that was actually really pivotal, and I think like illuminates like the big shift in our political landscape in California and in Sacramento County. At the end of 2022, um, for the first time ever, when we mobilized to ask the county um, uh, to reject this jail expansion. Again, by the way, this main jail expansion that I've been talking about, we canceled it in 2021, and they brought it back at the end of 2022 when there were, for the first time ever, like the new sheriff and DA rallied their supporters to advocate for a new jail and a jail expansion that we had never seen before. And so I think, the lawsuit provides such a perfect scapegoat for them for something that they really want anyways. And so they're also bringing in these arguments around population growth, which is such a tired argument that we've heard so many times, right, across the country of like, our population's growing, we need a bigger jail. And so, I think in our work with media and in our talking points, we continue to uplift that jail conditions have actually gotten worse under our new sheriff. And so, for example, our new sheriff has implemented mail scanning, which is, has been a thing for many years now, in especially federal prisons, but in county jails across California, more and more jails are scanning and destroying mail from loved ones, and including mail from organizations like ours, where before people could pass paper mail and share information, and now it's only on a tablet. And so, I think our focus this year for our campaign has been around pretrial. 80% of our jail population is pretrial. And so there's also been recent court cases, Humphrey and Welchin, that made it unconstitutional to hold people on bail if they can't afford to pay. And so what our county has been doing the last few years is actually shifting to a new system to where they're taking away bail altogether, and just putting people on probation, pretrial release. And our DA and sheriff are very much involved on the statewide level for like really horrific, tough on crime, and like repealing the progress that we've made policies. So they're both advocating to basically get rid of mental health diversion, which is one form of pretrial diversion that I actually have a family member on. And so and then also they advocated for Prop 36, which which passed in November of last year, which drastically increased sentences for drug possession and petty theft. So I will, to answer the actual question, I think while the sheriff and DA, weren't necessarily around for the lawsuit, they have so much in their power. The jail population's increasing under their new leadership, whereas we know that jail population reduction is a critical piece of meeting the consent decree. And they are it's just another level that we haven't seen before. Even though our previous sheriff was very much connected to Trump, but just wasn't as politically savvy, honestly, and as motivated. They both have their own podcast, and so we're just seeing on another level the appetite and the motivation for these new extreme tough on crime policies, which we've tried before, right? We've tried these for decades and they haven't worked. If they worked, we'd be we incarcerate more people than anywhere else, and we'd be the safest place than anywhere else, but they really don't. And so yeah, I just wanted to name that, and so we respond to as much as we possibly can when they're speaking to media. We I think try to correct all of the misinformation.
Thanks so much, Liz. We're coming up on time. Carrie Ann, did you want to add something real quick?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think this is the constant, the shape shifting, where the governor will look to, blame maybe lawmakers for not doing enough. Lawmakers will blame the Department of Corrections, and everybody's pointing the fingers at each other. So I think we try to keep saying that these are systems issues, and we need all stakeholders in the systems to do what's within their control, their power, without even additional funding to make these changes. And I think we need to just continue to call them out when they don't do so. And just a quick plot twist, the governor, in response to our latest press conference calling for not to spend more money on the jail, has thrown out the idea that instead of maybe building this mega jail, that maybe we should purchase the Honolulu Federal Detention Center, which is run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Additional nonsense. So again, this is shape shifting, and it goes to show that even if for the last 15, 20 years, we haven't built any newer jails or prisons, sometimes there'll go years of stretches, there's quiet, and then they resurrect, we're going to build this jail, and they move it from island to island. So the battle is constant, and I think we need to keep calling all of these actors for what they can control and fail to do.
Thanks. Yeah, that's man. It's always changing. Every day feels like something different. I cannot thank our panelists enough. These three fights are both very different and very similar, and being able to hear about the ways in which they differ and the ways in which they're the same has been so helpful. Um, I'm going to quickly move to just sharing some resources and some contact information, and then we'll wrap up. Let me get my PowerPoint back here. Um, remove some spotlights just to make sure we can see our. All right, so first, here is the contact information for our panelists. It includes, and we will send out this PowerPoint so you can actually click on these links and don't have to copy them down. But please pay attention, please look up our panelists' organizations, follow them on Instagram and X, and keep track of their fights. I think these are really, really valuable things. These are such important test cases, right? To be watching every step of as we see how we can apply the lessons of one place to another place. And then I wanted to talk about some of Prison Policy Initiative's resources and also another non-prison policy initiative resource that's really valuable. So we have on our what's called Advocacy Toolkit, which is a link at the top of our website, a number of resources for fighting jail expansion. One is called Does Our County Really Need a Bigger Jail? Which is a list of questions to ask your stakeholders about the system, about what the jail is like right now, to really spark conversation about whether a new jail is necessary. We also have a jail expansion toolkit, which includes a bunch of advice on reading jail needs assessments and gets into some of the detail that I was talking about earlier on that front. I also want to plug a resource that came out from Community Justice Exchange just a little while ago, called If They Build It, Organizing Lessons and Strategies Against Carceral Infrastructure. This resource pulls together lessons learned from the No New Jails Coalition, which was a national group of anti-carceral expansion organizations across the country. It's incredibly valuable in terms of pulling together advocacy strategies. What worked, what didn't, what to keep an eye out for. I can't recommend it enough. Please stay connected with Prison Policy Initiative. You can sign up for our newsletter at prisonpolicy.org/subscribe. We've also got social media. We have Instagram, we have LinkedIn, we have Twitter, we have Facebook. We also have Blue Sky. I should add that. But if you search for us on Blue Sky, you'll find us there too. And then you can also contact our advocacy department. That's me and Emmett. Particularly, please contact us if you are fighting a jail in your own in your own community and would like help or advice or any kind of assistance, sort of navigating those needs assessments and navigating the fight in general. You can see our emails here directly. You can also email the department more generally at advocacy@prisonpolicy.org. So thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. There will be a recording of this sent out. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again to our panelists. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.